Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome you once again on Wednesday nights with myself, Inayat Wadi, where we host panel discussions and look at issues right across the entire world, providing an in-depth analysis, unpacking major developments. Now, one major development that is taking place as we speak is the plight of Gaza once again, where the world continues to ignore Gaza's never-ending state of trauma. We know that the besieged Gaza Strip has faced yet another devastating, deadly Israeli attack, and the world still continues ignoring this endless trauma. Now, this week we saw this chilling operation once again named Truthful Dawn, where the Israeli regime, the Zionist regime, once again has been raining bombs on the besieged Gaza Strip. And 3 days of bombardment, killing many Palestinians, many injured, hundreds of people, and also looking at Gaza, mourning the death of 16 children that have been killed in the latest assault. And if that is not enough, it's again worsening the situation in Gaza, the hardships of life that people face on a day-to-day basis in the besieged Gaza Strip. And to many of us, we know it is the largest open-air prison in the world. Now, taking this discussion further in understanding the Israeli assault on Gaza, we are joined by our panelists this evening. We've got Shenilla Mohamed, who is the Executive Director, Amnesty International South Africa. We've got Taher Herzallah, who is an American with the American Muslims for Palestine, and we will also be joined by Dr. Ismail Patel, Friends of Aqsa. Now, I've seen the panelists are on screen already. To all of you, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome.
Thank you.
Yes, Ismail Patel, I'd like to start off with you because I believe you've got only about 15 minutes with us this evening. So we'd like to obviously try and get maximum out of you in unpacking and looking at this latest assault. And just in understanding this latest assault, I'm sure many of us are not surprised that this has happened, because this has become an occurrence that has happened far too frequently. And just your initial assessment on the latest developments that have taken place in the assault on Gaza.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and I'm sure the other two guests will try and expand on what I say. And I also need to apologize that I need to leave early because I'm going to a demonstration in London. What I would like to emphasize is the fact that we shouldn't see this attack, the present attack on Gaza, in isolation, but it should be seen as a concerted effort from the allies of Israel itself. Israel is capable of doing what it's doing because it's got the green light from America and major European powers. And we, especially the international community in Europe and America, need to re-emphasize our efforts, we need to double our efforts and make sure that we lobby and campaign against our respective governments. Because Israel's actions have become so wanton, so blatant and brazen, that no people and no country can get away with. I mean, it's violating international laws, Geneva Conventions, basic human rights. Despite that, not much has been covered by the mainstream media. And therefore, we have to understand that Israel's actions cannot be seen in isolation. They have to be seen as a major global narrative of the Palestinians, or the undermining of the Palestinians. And therefore, we, particularly Europe and in America, need to act more and redouble our efforts to try and make sure that Israel doesn't get away with what it's doing, because I fear that Israel, as day by day, week by week, is going to escalate its attacks and is going to even carry out greater massacres than it's been done in the past.
Well, certainly, and also looking at it, the cost of human life, and looking at the humanitarian tragedy that is unfolding, Shenilla. And we know life has not been easy for the Palestinians, for the people living in Gaza. And with every war, with every operation that Israel undertakes, every attack, that the conditions have actually become more and more difficult for the Palestinians, particularly those in Gaza.
Absolutely. And as Dr. Ismail says, that the latest offenses on Gaza should not be viewed out of context. And the context is this: it's an ongoing illegal Israeli blockade and collective punishment since 2007. We've seen 4 devastating offenses since 2008. And we've seen a cruel apartheid regime that is suffocating all Palestinians. And I mean, I think it's really important to note that the 15-year-olds in Gaza, that all they have seen is the blockade and the human rights violations. I mean, they have grown up in this horrendous cesspool of human rights violations, of killings, of executions, and the international community is to blame, as Dr. Ismail says, for this continuing violent, oppressive force that is literally suffocating the people of Gaza.
Well, certainly. And just talking of the international community, Taher, looking at the world and how the world has continued to ignore Gaza's never-ending state of trauma.
Absolutely. And although there is a global solidarity with the Palestinian people, the United States essentially has created a structure by which actual implementation of accountability towards Israel is in the international arena is nearly impossible, especially since the United States has the most powerful say in the U.S. Security Council, UN Security Council, preventing any leverage or accountability towards Israel whatsoever from other countries who might even seek to punish Israel for its crimes against the Palestinian people. This is the situation that we're dealing with today. We're also, this recent attack on Gaza comes at the backdrop of the Arab normalizations that have been happening in the region. The UAE, Bahrain, and many others were claiming that when they were normalizing with Israel during the so-called Abraham Accords, that this would be a step towards alleviating the suffering of the Palestinian people. They lied to their own citizens and to the Palestinian people that this normalization would create a better environment for the Palestinian people, would prevent further attacks and would prevent further violence. And we have seen nothing but the opposite. We have seen that Israel feels more emboldened today than ever before to wantonly attack the Palestinian people and to brazenly kill and murder Palestinian children in Gaza without any recourse or accountability. And this is the situation that we're dealing with today.
Well, it certainly is a dire situation. And also, Ismail Patel, when one looks at the United Nations, for instance, where back in 2012, the United Nations actually predicted that Gaza would be unlivable by 2020. Now, that is now close on to 10 years ago. And by many accounts, this prediction has proven to be right. We know of the 2 million people that are in the largest open-air prison in the world. And yet, we see Palestinians continue living there, but also at the same time being on the receiving end of, as Shenilla mentioned, collective punishment, being in an open-air prison. Many people have not been able to live even a normal life. Now, with the UN making these type of predictions, yet the world has chosen to actually ignore this, and this was 10 years ago. And we know that, it's not only 10 years ago, we can go very, very far back. We can go back decades as far as Palestine is concerned, and the occupation, the brutal occupation in more ways than one.
Yes, I mean, it beggars belief, really, that all international instruments and organizations have been warning the impending crisis. And remember, this crisis is not natural. It's been created by human beings, and it's been created by Israel in particular, and the international community. And we need to just look at the contrast of how the world has reacted, the Western world has reacted vis-a-vis Ukraine. When Russia invaded Ukraine, whichever part of the political divide you may be, but there's no denying that the emotions, the outpouring of emotion in the West was phenomenal. They're sending help, they're sending aid, they're welcoming the refugees, and so forth. Yet when it's happening to the Palestinians at the behest of another power, Israel, the international community remains silent. And this is something very important for us to understand, that the crisis in Gaza and in Palestine by extension is created by Israel. And therefore, this is a political crisis. And the impasse is a political one. And we need to work politically to make sure that we disengage Israel. We make sure that we make Israel pariah and make it accountable for the crimes it's committing. And only through that, and only that way, can we end the occupation and end the suffering of the Palestinians. Of course, and here I'm sort of slightly indicating that there is much needed aid, humanitarian aid that is required in Gaza and for the Palestinians, which should carry on. But we shouldn't exclusively reserve our energies and our efforts 100% on that. While we carry on that, we should also make sure that we invest enough in political movements and NGOs and lobbyists who are trying to change the situation on the ground. And it is only through that we'll be able to bring about a change. The people of Gaza have been suffering for too many years, too many decades. And the crisis, as the United Nations have indicated, that no human being should be able to be living in those kind of conditions without sort of sounding patronizing. If animals were living in the state the people of Gaza are staying today, the world would have risen up in emotions and made sure that the condition changed. I mean, something like 95% of the water is not consumable or not fit for human consumption. Over 55% of people in Gaza are depending on aid and soup kitchens. Over half of Gaza population is unemployed. We have people without homes for years and decades. We have a youth who, as Shenilla has already indicated, not knowing any different but occupation and blockade. This is no way to treat human beings, let live alone animals. And this is a crisis created by Israel, by human beings, and we have to stop that crisis.
Well, we certainly do, because also, Shenilla, when one looks at the scars that the people of Gaza have suffered over the years, we're talking of both physical and mental scars, the mental injuries that they've sustained over a period of time. And what would it actually do to a nation that is constantly trying to recover from previous bombardments, from previous assaults, from previous brutal assaults? And, every now and then we find that, these assaults continue and history repeating itself over and over again.
Well, I think, as Dr. Ismail says, that, the situation in Gaza is really as a result of failures by the international community, by, the institutions that are supposed to be protecting people like the people of Palestine have failed dismally. And we're talking about, institutions like the UN, the ICC, the International Criminal Court. And, one of the things that has to happen is that the international community must urgently address the root causes of what's going on in Israel. And, and this includes, the long-standing Israeli war crimes. I mean, Amnesty International has consistently called on the ICC to investigate Israel because we believe that war crimes are being committed there. And, other crimes, and Israel is constantly in violation of international law. The other big the call that we've been making consistently to the UN is that they must immediately impose a comprehensive arms embargo on Israel and on the Palestinian arms groups to prevent future crimes and to prevent future human rights violations. And what we've been saying consistently is governments who continue to supply Israel with arms and shield it from accountability at the UN are actually supporting a system of apartheid and undermining international legal order and exacerbating the suffering of the Palestinian people. And as a result, what we see is a highly traumatized society, but as the doctor has pointed out, a society that is being deprived of basic human rights, the right to food, the right to shelter, the right to safety, the right to life. All these things are being violated by the present status quo. And the blame is really entirely at the door of the international community. They have failed the people of Gaza, they have failed the people of Palestine, and they have failed the people of the world because our institutions are being rendered useless by countries that are violating these laws continuously with impunity.
Yes, in fact, I just want to bring Dr. Ismail back in because I know you've got to rush off in the next few minutes. And just moving away from Gaza and also looking at the same time at the developments that are taking place in Al-Quds and looking at Al-Aqsa, and we know what has been taking place there for the last few days. So just before we take leave of you, just a quick comment on what is taking place at Al-Aqsa.
Well, of course, the attacks are continuing. When we see what's happening in Gaza, I suppose we shouldn't forget what's happening to the rest of Palestine, Jerusalem, Masjid al-Aqsa, and West Bank. Today, we've already received news that two young Palestinians have been murdered in Hebron and West Bank. The attacks and constraints to the right of access to religious sites are continually being exercised in Palestine. Both Muslims are not allowed to enter Masjid al-Aqsa, and we should not forget that the Christians are not allowed to access the Church of Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem as well. So they're also suffering, and this is something that we need to highlight all the time, that while we talk about the majority of Palestinian residents being Muslims, there is a significant number of non-Muslims there, including Christians, who are also suffering. And the churches, as well as the mosques and masajids, are all impacted by Israeli occupation and apartheid policies. The basic human rights, as already been mentioned many a times in this conversation, are being denied to the Palestinians. The right to even pray and access their religious sites have been denied. And here, I think we as international global society, either be Muslims or Christians or people of all faith and no faith, must rise up and make sure that we come to the defense of the occupied and the marginalized people of Palestine.
Well, Dr. Ismail Patel, I know you've got to rush, but we thank you. We do appreciate you taking time out, joining us this evening for this panel discussion. We wish you all the best, and also at the demonstration and protest, all the best to you, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam, and thank you to my fellow guests as well.
Yes, we will continue with you, Taher, and just following up from what Dr. Ismail Patel has said is we are focusing on Gaza, but also let us not forget the rest of Palestine, because a lot of developments are taking place. But also at the same time, we're talking about NGOs, we're talking about many agencies right across the entire world, and here we're talking about official agencies like the UN agency recognizing the fact that, looking at, and they've documented the never-ending crises that have been taking place in Palestine, in Gaza, particularly looking at the mental health crisis. And, with all of these documenting all these developments that are taking place, and most of it trauma associated, at the end of the day, it does appear that this is just a paper exercise, but there doesn't seem to be a concerted effort on the part of the powers that be, on the part of international agencies, to do something. And as Shenilla mentioned, talking about things like arms embargo, and it is just business as usual as far as the attitude towards Israel goes.
Yeah, I mean, I think you brought up an excellent point, which it's connected to the point that our sister Shenilla brought up earlier about the broader context of the situation and the assault on Gaza. And I think it's important for us to understand the assault on Gaza in the broader context of what was taking place. Israel had this operation planned out thoroughly, months in advance. And the reason why we know that is because this attack happened just weeks after President Joe Biden visited Israel, Palestine in July, and essentially gave the green light to the Israelis to conduct this operation. That's number one. Number two is Israel has been trying to provoke an attack from particularly the Palestinian Islamic Jihad group in Gaza for quite some time. And the way they've been trying to do that is by attacking and arresting the Palestinian Islamic Jihad leadership in the West Bank, in order to provoke an attack from the Palestinian Islamic Jihad in Gaza. That did not work, and that angered the Israeli military establishment. They began to evacuate all of the southern towns that are bordering Gaza in preparation for a large-scale assault a couple weeks before the assault on Gaza. So it was clear that they were planning this operation, and they were clear that they had a motive to attack Gaza. And the other reason why we know this was planned in advance is because the U.S. State Department's official statement essentially looked like it had been drafted a week ago or a week before the operation. It was a clear and complete support for Israel's quote-unquote right to defend itself. The same language that we've been hearing time and time again, but this time it was clear that the United States was not interested in even giving homage or some lip service to Palestinian lives, It was clearly only focused on Israel's right to quote unquote defend itself, which made absolutely no sense since Israel was the one who quote unquote preemptively attacked Gaza this time. So this is the problem that we've been facing and that we've been seeing. And so when Israel's assault on Gaza began, and the assassination of the Islamic Jihad leadership took place in Gaza, then it was a surgical strike for 56 hours or more, and pummeled Gaza, killed 45 people, injured 300 more, 16 of them children that were absolutely massacred in their homes as they sat in wait. And this is a clearly planned operation. Afterwards, Israel unilaterally announced a ceasefire without even discussing a single time with Islamic Jihad anything with regards to a truce. So clearly they wanted to go in, they wanted to go out, they wanted to fulfill their military objectives, and they wanted to create a situation where they would cause a division within the Palestinian factions in Gaza, because they were clearly targeting one faction and not the others. And this is a situation that we've seen in prior situations, but not to this scale and not to the level of intensity of bombardment that we've seen in this particular moment. So this is so just to give you an idea of the broader context. This is what we've been looking at. This also goes with the backdrop of the situation that's taking place north of Gaza, and that is the conflict that Israel today has with Lebanon. It's clear that Israel is preparing for a potential military-style invasion of Lebanon or an attack on Lebanon to some degree if the agreement is not made between Lebanon and Israel over the maritime borders and the natural gas fields that are in the Mediterranean Ocean that both Lebanon and Israel claim. Hezbollah has clearly stated that if Israel makes a claim and if Israel begins to take the natural gas out of the Mediterranean, that Hezbollah will attack the Israeli boats and supply lines. So clearly, Israel is preparing by weakening the resistance in Gaza, so that in the event a war starts in the north with Lebanon or with Hezbollah, that they will not be fighting a war on two fronts. And so this is another calculation that Israel has made. And obviously, and most importantly, the current Israeli prime minister is not known to be a strong man. Lapid is someone who just took office, and he is preparing for the next election and wants to show that he is a strong man, that he can also conduct operations on Gaza, and he could discipline Gaza in the way that he wants, just to show that he is more like Netanyahu, so that he can also build a right-wing alliance in the parliament. And so all of these factors led to the assault on Gaza, unfortunately, completely out of Palestinian hands. Palestinians in Gaza were caught completely off guard by this operation. They did not expect it, as there had been no prior provocation, and no Palestinian faction was involved in anything in so far as attacks on Israel. So this is something that was clearly planned out, clearly operated, and it was also prepared for months in advance. And the reason why I also say that is because here in the United States, we saw that the Israeli propaganda machine was operating full force, justifying Israel's attack on Gaza. They made the entire story about the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. There was YouTube ads on YouTube. Millions of people received these ads when they just go simply on YouTube. On social media, they had the trolls operating full force from the moment the assassination of the Islamic Jihad leader took place till the last moments of Israeli bombardment and the ceasefire. The trolls continued to operate and to construct the Israeli narrative to the American public about what was taking place. And mind you, again, this is just, a couple weeks after the U.S. assassination of Ayman Zawahiri with a drone strike. So Israel felt that they had the political cover and the public support, so to speak, to also assassinate another quote-unquote terrorist in the same way that the United States had done with Ayman al-Zawahiri in Afghanistan. So again, this is a well-played out operation and well-planned out move. And so it's important for us to look at all of these details when we look at how and why Gaza continuously gets assaulted. The Israelis see Gaza as a playing field. They see Gaza as a political opportunity. They see Gaza as a problem that needs to be managed, but not an issue that needs to be solved. And so long as this remains the case, and the international community does not act to end the siege and end the occupation, then we will be seeing more and more of these attacks. We will be seeing more of these so-called surgical strikes that kill Palestinian men, women, and children. And the Palestinian people in Gaza will continue to suffer.
Yes, Taher. And also, Shenilla, when we look at the hypocrisy of the international community, where we're looking at this ongoing state of trauma with the devastating assault on Gaza, and the Palestinians are saying, we know we are not Ukraine. And this is where the hypocrisy actually manifests itself, because this is what the international community is doing. They do what is best by providing the Israeli regime with full impunity when one compares developments that have taken place between Russia and Ukraine and what is taking place in Palestine and Gaza.
Well, absolutely not, and I think the you can already from what's happening in Gaza, we saw the recent assassination in front of the entire world of Al Jazeera journalist Shireen Abu Akleh. We saw investigations being done which pointed directly to Israel's culpability in all of this, and yet we are still waiting to see action. Once again, there is impunity, and I think the reality is that there's so much evidence with each day, with every day of violence and brutality in Gaza and in wider Palestine, the evidence continues to mount and mount and mount, and yet we do not see any action. I mean, in February this year, Amnesty International released a report which was building on the work of other organizations like B'Tselem, like Human Rights Watch, in which we actually defined, what Israel was doing to the Palestinians as a cruel system of domination and a crime against humanity. We called on the International Criminal Court to have an open investigation to add crimes against humanity and crimes of apartheid to their investigation. But the reality is that the double standards and which were very glaring during when the war in Ukraine was had started, continue to be the problem in the international global governance systems. One of the things that I must say is that South Africa is not one of those countries that is doing this. I mean, I think that South Africa, and we have had numerous meetings with Minister Pandor as well as with her teams at DIRCO. They are really keen on trying to push for some type of accountability at the UN, and are really looking to use the evidence gathered by organizations like Amnesty, B'Tselem, Human Rights Watch to try to bring about that accountability. But as Brother Taher has said, the reality is that the more powerful states that control the narrative at a global level are still getting the upper hand. And I think it's really important for states around the world to actually stand up against and really take up their moral and legal responsibility to take immediate action. I mean, I think the impunity with which the Israeli state operates, the fact that nobody is ever brought to account, the fact that people are dying continuously, the fact that the human rights violations in Gaza and the way in which people are forced to live there, is just unacceptable by any standard, and nothing is done about it, is a shame. It's actually a shame on the institutions of the world, and it's a shame on the global leaders of this world, because it's because of them that Israel continues to operate with impunity, and that no action is taken. And whereas we know that what Israel is doing is a crime against humanity. We know that the ICC should be taking action against Israel, but we see that the pace at which it all moves is just unacceptable. How many more people have to die in Palestine before the international community actually does what they're supposed to do? And I think more and more citizens need to stand up. I think we have to depend on ourselves as the citizens of the world to actually stand up against this, because the leaders of this world are not showing leadership when it comes to the Palestinian-Israeli situation.
Well, clearly, Shenilla, and as you mentioned, it's a shame. And also, Taher, looking at how shameless these politicians are. When you spoke about Joe Biden's visit to Israel, but also when one looks at Britain, for instance, their foreign secretary Liz Truss, and again, not even bothering to even sugarcoat the unconditional support that they actually give Israel, where she issued a statement, and this was soon after this latest round of atrocities that have been committed by the Zionist army, saying that the UK stands by Israel and its right to defend itself. And these are the type of sentiments that they express over and over again. And as Shenilla mentioned, it's a crying shame. But this is just how shameless these politicians can be at a time of crisis like this.
Absolutely. I mean, completely, utterly shameless, despicable responses from the U.S. administration. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has gone out of his way to justify Israel's attack against Gaza, just like he went out of his way to justify Israel's murder of the Palestinian-American journalist Shireen Abu Akleh just 2 months prior. In every instance that we've seen, this U.S. administration, which claims to be centering human rights in their foreign policy, has been openly advocating for Israel's continued military aggressions against Palestinians, has held Israel accountable, has not held Israel accountable whatsoever for anything that Israel has done, even against Palestinian American citizens. People who hold U.S. passports, like Shireen Abu Akleh, like Omar Asad, who have been killed by Israeli forces in the past 7-8 months. Yet Israel continues to operate with carte blanche support from the United States. And on top of this absurdity that the United States official statements, we have seen that the U.S. Congress wants to replenish Israel's quote unquote stockpile of weapons. U.S. stockpile weapons in Israel. They want to increase funding for military support and weapons to the state of Israel, even despite the human rights violations that Israel continues to inflict on the Palestinian people. And for us, this is where we are taking a stand as a movement for Palestinian rights here in the United States. There's been a very strong and voiceful, very loud effort to sanction Israel, to prevent more funding, more military funding going to Israel, and holding Israel accountable through the different mechanisms that we use, whether through the federal government and beyond. So this is something that is of major concern to us. It does not fall on deaf ears that the U.S. administration is so blatantly in support of what Israel is doing, and especially an administration which claims to be centering human rights in its foreign policy.
Yes, and also as far as accountability goes, Shenilla, and we know that the Israeli, the Zionist entity has been traumatizing. They've been killing, they've been maiming Palestinians for decades, and at this point in time, there have been zero consequences, and there's been absolutely no accountability. Now, how does one actually address this issue of accountability?
Well, Inayat, one of the things that our report, that we released in February, and it's 187 pages of evidence that we gathered over, between 2 to 4 years. One of the things that really struck me when reading that report is that Israel considers Palestinians and treats Palestinians as a democratic threat. So for them, the mere existence of Palestinians is, they consider it to be a threat. And since its establishment in 1948, Israel has pursued a policy of establishing and maintaining a Jewish demographic majority. And we see this, in the way that they try to maximize control over land, and everything is to the benefit of the Jewish Israelis. Now, I think that, the fact that they continue to use this rhetoric, and again, you find the Americans using it as well, that, the reason Israel does what they do is that they're trying to protect themselves. They have the right to protect themselves. And they use this whole narrative of Palestinians, whether it's a child or whether it's an adult, as being a threat. And I think, the problem that we're seeing is that narrative is really the narrative that is being pushed in the global arenas, that, the only reason Israel behaves the way that they do is because, the Palestinians actually are a threat. And, when you compare that to what happened during the apartheid era in South Africa, Black people were considered to be a huge demographic threat to the minority white population. And we saw the way in which they were also the similarities are just just horrendous. The way the forceful removals, the extrajudicial assassinations, the killings of people indiscriminately, putting people into boxes like in places and not allowing them to cross over in the same way that people in Gaza are. And I think that that is the biggest problem, is that Israel continues to pretend or say that the people of Palestine are a threat to them. Now, what is the way forward? I mean, you asked about accountability. I mean, I think that accountability really lies at the door of the entire the political institutions and organizations around the world. And I think, as the doctor said earlier, it's got to be a political solution. I mean, and unfortunately, what we've seen, as Brother Taher has said, is that the politics are really not in favor of the Palestinians. So we've seen the way in which the Arab countries have started to normalize relationships with Israel. We've seen how, there is less and less support for the Palestinians coming out from the global world. And I think, it's really about really brutal forces scratching each other's back. And we know that Saudi has been in the forefront of trying to normalize these relationships. And we know that Saudi itself is a horrible, brutal force in the world. We saw what was done, to Adnan, to Khashoggi. And there's been impunity. There has been, really no accountability from the Saudis, despite the fact that reports have pointed to the fact that the Saudi government was involved in that murder. And innocents, as far as Amnesty is concerned, were sent and were held accountable for something that they were not responsible for. So I think really what we're seeing globally is a question of, is states that are themselves in violation of international law and human rights law supporting each other. Now, where is, what do we do? And I think the work that Brother Taher and the doctor are doing is really critical. And I think, the work that people are doing to expose more and more what Israel is doing, but then holding the ICC to account. I feel that is where accountability has to come from. We have to force the International Criminal Court to actually do what they have been set up to do, which is hold violators of international law and human rights violation and war crimes to account. And that is the one thing that Amnesty International is determined to do. We are going to push and push for the International Criminal Court to do their job and to really, bring the Israeli government to the court, as they have done in the past with other, people that they have felt are guilty. They are failing when it comes to Israel. They are failing when it comes to Saudi Arabia. And we, as the citizens of the world, have to make sure that we do not allow them to continue to fail. So that is where accountability sits. And then, of course, the pressure that, the communities around the globe continue to put on their governments. South Africa is really trying very hard within Africa to stop Israel from taking over the African Union and being part, becoming an observer. South Africa is fighting a lone battle there. And I think it's really important that other countries step up and support South Africa in its fight to keep Israel out of Africa. And Israel is throwing, there's a lot of money being thrown around, and, African countries are falling prey to the influence of Israel. So we're seeing a lot of pressure, and South Africa must, step up and put pressure on African countries. South African citizens must step up and put pressure on African citizens to stop this control of Israel. So there's a lot we can do in NIAT, and I think there's a lot that is being done. I think the question is just, we need to start seeing results now.
Well, certainly we need to see results. And also, Taher, earlier on, you made mention of Joe Biden and his visit to Israel. And we know after that he visited Saudi Arabia. And you spoke about the normalization between some of the Arab countries and Israel, the likes of the UAE, Morocco, Bahrain. We've seen that taking place. And Saudi Arabia, obviously, it is no secret that a lot is taking place behind the scenes between Saudi Arabia and Israel. Now, looking at even a country like Egypt, for instance, that was at the forefront of trying to mediate or broker some sort of a truce together with Qatar. But once again, the hypocrisy manifesting itself very, very blatantly. We know about the Rafah crossing. We know the harm that the Egyptian government under Sisi in particular has done to the cause of the people of Palestine, to the people of Gaza in a particular. Now, these are players that are at the forefront, that are playing out, that are mediating, that are trying to broker a truce. And I just like your thoughts, on the Arab world in general and their attitude towards the people of Palestine and the Palestinian struggle.
I think it's undeniable that the situation the Palestinian people find ourselves in today is one of the worst that we've ever experienced, where governments are acting against principle, against common sense, against logic and human rights and the freedom of and liberation of the Palestinian people, which was so central to so many Arab governments in the past, is slowly eroding and dwindling in support from these governments. However, the masses, it's undeniable also that the masses are unequivocally in support of the Palestinian people and against what the state of Israel is doing. I mean, this is something that any transparent and nonpartisan poll will show. The thinking and the opinions of the Arab public when it comes to the cause of Palestine and Zionism and Israel, it's clear. The question here is, you have a country like Egypt which participates in these truce negotiations every so often, and helps facilitate this discussion with Israel, and acts as sort of as a neutral third party when it comes to an attack on Gaza. The problem with this, is that Egypt maintains the siege on Gaza. Egypt is in full cooperation with Israel when it comes to security. Egypt closes and opens the borders at will, the Rafah crossing at will at times, and leaves people stranded for months on end in Gaza, stuck without an ability to leave to pursue medical care or education or anything for that matter. And so this is the problem that we're dealing with. On one hand, you have countries who claim to be playing a positive role in the situation in Palestine, while also continuously de-developing Gaza, destroying Gaza from within, diminishing the Palestinian cause, normalizing with Zionists who want to take over Masjid al-Aqsa and claim Masjid al-Aqsa as their own. This is the situation. It's a very disturbing time for the Palestinian people, despite the gains that we've made here in Washington on the political scene, and despite the fact that there is sort of light at the end of the tunnel, from as far as we can tell, and a new horizon when it comes to American politics and the changing landscape. The situation in Palestine continues to deteriorate. This is the paradox that we're in today. The situation in Palestine continues to deteriorate, as was mentioned earlier today, that Israel didn't stop killing Palestinians once the truce was announced, once the ceasefire was announced a couple of days ago. Israel, since the ceasefire was announced in Gaza just a few days ago, has already killed four or five Palestinians in the West Bank already. One of them being a major individual in Nablus just yesterday. So, Israel's murder of Palestinians doesn't stop. It's a continuous process. Israel's ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people is a continuous process. And as was mentioned by Sister Shenilla, political solutions need to take place. Humanitarian aid is wonderful. NGOs can do some work here and there, but if there's no political will to engage Israel and to change the geopolitical situation that keeps Palestinians under the boot of the Israeli occupation, then this is going to continue, for the time being and for the foreseeable future. And that's why it's important for all of us to rise up and to stand up and to take action on our own. We have our own agency as individuals. We have our ability to act against what Israel is doing, whether our government supports those actions or not. Luckily for you all in South Africa, the South African government has been very incredibly supportive of the Palestinian people and has taken many steps, as you mentioned. In the United States, we have a different situation entirely, and that's why so many people who support Palestine are engaged in the boycott of Israel. as a mechanism to hold Israel accountable for its crimes against the Palestinian people. And so we hope and we urge all people of conscience around the world to participate in boycotting, divesting, and sanctioning Israel until they meet the demands of the Palestinian people, until the occupation is ended and Palestinian people will be free.
Yes. And also, Shenilla, when one looks at a civil society, and we know what it had taken place, where we've seen that the huge outcry against Israel, almost every major city in the world, where we saw those masses of people, huge, massive demonstrations right across the entire world. So when one looks at ordinary people, when one just looks at civil society, when one looks at many organizations that support the Palestinian cause, we've made huge inroads. We've made massive inroads as far as civil society is concerned, and this obviously needs to be escalated to the likes of governments like we do here in South Africa, reaching out to the South African government. In the past, we've seen our government downgrade the Israeli embassy as well, downgrade their status. And this is a type of action that is required over and above, obviously, the BDS movement that Taher talks about. I think, Shenilla, you've just froze for a minute. Perhaps you'd just like to comment while Shenilla tries to connect again. I see she is connecting. Shenilla?
Yeah, I'm back. Sorry, my thing went down. I mean, just quickly, I think one of the biggest challenges we're facing on the Palestinian issue is that if you recall, during apartheid, there was not a day that went by when the issue of apartheid was not out there, was not being shouted across the world. And I think, we need a similar shout from the rooftops with when it comes to Palestine. I think what's happened is that the media has been taken over by the certain states and certain groupings and conglomerates who are preventing this, but that doesn't prevent us as citizens, as organizations, etc., to keep on pushing the call for Palestinians to be free. And Israel needs to be hit where it will hurt the most. And this is why I think that, for example, South Africa has got products from the occupied territories come to South Africa. And, in the beginning, they used to be labeled, if you recall, as sort of made in Israel or coming from Israel. And of course, when people raised objections to that, they took, those labels were taken off. But, it's under international law. It is illegal for any products from the occupied territories to be sold to be sold in countries. And yet they come through to South Africa. And, South Africans, we don't know about this. There's nothing that we're doing about it. And I think, we really do have to start hitting Israel where it hurts. The issue of, boycotts, the issue of not buying products coming from Israel. I think we have to do that. And one of the things as Amnesty South Africa we're going to be doing is we're going to be doing research that is really tracking the flow of goods from the occupied territories to Africa and to South Africa, and where do they land? And also, a lot of money goes from here to Israel. There's a lot of support for Israel coming out of South African pockets. And I think, that's another thing that we need to look at, is that money, how is that money going out there? Is it being laundered, etc.? And I think, we really do have to start taking actions that are more concrete, in addition to the calls and in addition to the solidarity. We have to start hitting Israel where it hurts the most. We have to start putting pressure on South Africa to stop supplying arms to Saudi, for example, because those arms then get sold in other places. There's a lot we can do, but I think that as Brother Taher says, there is a light at the end of the tunnel, but we have to start lighting those candles one by one. That will get us to the end of that tunnel. And I think the work has begun. And I think but unfortunately, the people of Palestine are still sitting in hell on earth. And that is one thing that, is acceptable. And I feel the dehumanization of Palestinians is another thing that has really taken hold in the world. No longer does the sight of young children being buried seem to affect the world. And yet when Ukraine was happening, people were driving in their cars to pick up Ukrainians from borders, and yet Palestinian children, Palestinian lives don't seem to have the same value. And I think that for me is one of the most horrendous things about the state of the world at the moment. And I think we, and particularly those of us of Muslim origin, have to really stand up and fight for what is right. And I think it's not just a Muslim sort of battle, it's a battle for the world. And I think we have to, hinge it on humanity and the double standards and the inequality and the fact that some lives matter more than others. And that is the fight that we have to put out there, in addition to BDS and other fights that are happening and the fights on the political arena.
Yes, Shenilla, and also talking about the media conglomerates, Taher, I'm not too sure whether Taher is with us. I don't see him on screen. But Shenilla, in fact, when one looks at the world media and how desensitized they have actually become, like you mentioned, images of little children being killed, where we've seen in the past where one image like that, would go viral right across the entire world. And this would make maximum impact. I see Taher is with us. And also, Taher, just looking at the world media, and we know that some of the major conglomerates, come from the United States of America. Some of them are in Britain as well. But also in terms of social media as well, social media can play a major role in highlighting the plight of the people of Palestine. We know that, some people, obviously, when one looks at Twitter, we've heard about Dr. Ramzi Baroud, whose Twitter account was actually blocked. So they are going to be targeting certain individuals on social media. But that platform is huge. It's massive. And this is where, this continuous struggle needs to carry on, using social media, making sure that the message goes loud, clear, and a very, very strong, a very, very powerful message as far as the plight of the people of Palestine goes, and more importantly, the actions that are required to put a lot more pressure on the oppressors.
Absolutely. I mean, despite Israel's best efforts to constantly dominate the narrative and control the narrative as to what is taking place on the ground in Palestine, information is being sent out from Palestinians who are battling and resisting the state of Israel's occupation and ethnic cleansing and apartheid practices on a daily basis. The unhindered flow of information coming from Palestinians through social media channels and other channels is really critical to understanding what is taking place, correcting the false narrative that Israel continues to propagate in international media. Despite Israel's best efforts, like I said, there's been many efforts by the Israelis over the past 5 years in particular to begin to censor speech on Palestine. As you mentioned, the account of Dr. Ramzi Baroud being canceled or being stopped or terminated on social media is one example of this. They have relationships with major tech companies like Facebook and Twitter that they have established this relationship to define what is allowed or political speech and what is not allowed. And this is something that we are actively fighting against because the social media work and information that we've been able to utilize in order to fuel our work in the United States has in many ways pulled the rug from underneath the feet of the major media conglomerates because that is what was used to control the narrative on the issue of Palestine and Israel. And Israel also recognizes that public opinion is shifting drastically in the United States in favor of in support of the Palestinian people and Palestinian human rights. And so they know that the time is running out, and they know that policy will catch up to public opinion eventually. Just as it did in the situation with South African apartheid, the U.S. public was far more supportive of the anti-apartheid movement than U.S. Congress was. It took the U.S. Congress more than 2 decades to catch up to where the population was at with regards to apartheid South Africa, and only unwittingly did they finally take steps to end the relationship with the apartheid regime. This is something that is very well known, and so we know that in the policy circles, they're the last to come to the right side. so to speak. And that's why it's important for civil society to continue to be well informed about what is taking place. That is why it's important for advocates for Palestine to continue to talk about Palestine, despite what efforts may be or obstacles may be put in our path, and to inform the public about what is taking place in Palestine, as we have been doing on campuses, on university campuses across the country, as we've been doing in developing and cultivating intersectional relationships with communities of color and others all across the United States, in order to also inform them of the situation and relate it to their lives. As Edward Said, the late Palestinian professor, said that Palestine in America is not an issue of foreign policy; it's an issue of domestic policy, because of how closely tied and related the United States is to the state of Israel, and how so many systems of oppression are interlinked in the United States with the systems of oppression in Israel. And so for us, this is very critical to understand, and we hope that we continue to advocate in this regard.
Well, absolutely. One cannot stress enough, Taher, in terms of what you're saying and how critical this is. And Shenilla, we've got about 5 minutes actually, and time has actually flown during this discussion. Just some final thoughts, Shenilla, before we wind down the program. If you could unmute your mic, please, Shenilla. There you go.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
I just wanted to end using the words of Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela once said that, we will never be free until Palestine is free. And I think, that is really something that we should keep in our heads, that none of us will ever be free until the people of Palestine are free, until the human rights violations that they are facing, until we start seeing them as violations on our own humanity, we will need to continue to fight. And as Brother Taher says, the voice of those that get the information from Palestine, and us finding ways to sort of push the voices of the people of Palestine and what they're going through is so important. And I totally agree with what Brother Taher said, that it's through all these efforts that at some point the tables are going to shift. And already, we're seeing a lot of movement. And I think, really for the people of Palestine, my final words is that, those of us that are standing in solidarity with the people of Palestine should never step back and should never lose an opportunity to show solidarity with the people of Palestine. And that includes every single one of the people who live in South Africa, because the world showed solidarity to us, and it's our turn now to pay back with showing solidarity to the people of Palestine, who also stood with us during apartheid.
Well, shukran for that, Shenilla. Taher, final thought from you.
This initiative where you've brought in an international panel from the UK, the United States, and South Africa to discuss this is really critical. One of the things that I fear is that the Palestinian people will lose their support from the global South and from people around the world who have a natural affinity towards Palestine. In the process of the 75 years of occupation, Palestinians have historically had such tremendous relationships with the anti-apartheid struggle and so many revolutionaries around the world. And now that the U.S. structure exists and has been imposed on the Palestinian people, I fear that those relationships are not a priority, and we must continue to engage with people like yourselves and others around the world who are voiceful and so assertively advocates of Palestine, and for me, this is an absolute pleasure to be joining you today, and I will continue to join you and support your efforts.
Well, it's been an absolute pleasure having both of you, Taher, Herzallah, and also Shenilla Mohamed. We do appreciate you taking time out talking to us, and also having Dr. Ismail Patel early on as well. So we look forward to having further engagements, further discussions. But for now, once again, we appreciate your time. Shukran for that. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Director of Amnesty International South Africa, Taher Herzallah, Director, Outreach and Grassroots Organizing for American Muslims for Palestine. And for a few minutes, we had Dr. Ismail Adam Patel, who unfortunately he had to rush because he had a demonstration to attend, chairman of Friends of Aqsa. Well, that brings us to the end of part one of tonight's discussion. We will continue at around 8, from 8 to 9. We'll be talking to Philip Dexter, co-founder of the Pan-African Institute for Socialism. And the question we are raising tonight is, are some media in South Africa captured? We'll be talking with Philip Dexter, and then we'll also have the right of reply coming through from Mika Reddy Amapungani. Stay with us, don't go away.